Little noise out in the hall today, that's all. So thank you. On the bill, I'm just going to make a statement.
On the bill, sir. Thank you
very much.
Guess what?
It's my job right now, Mr. Aubrey. On the bill.
But thank you, Mr. Sponsor, so they can hear me.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out, and he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in state government. On today's show, we'll check in with Democratic operative Bradley Honan, CEO and president of the Honan Strategy Group, who will join us to make the case that power is more decentralized in Albany these days, something I'm skeptical of, but willing to be convinced about. And don't miss our bonus episode with Bradley, where we talked about the potential fallout for Democrats in New York if they mess with the election calendar, again, something I'm skeptical about, and we discussed polling of the New York City Democratic mayoral primary. But first, we're going to bring you our first ever update for a segment that we're calling Delgado Watch. And our first guest is Jason Bieferman, author of New York Playbook PM from Politico, who tracked down the elusive lieutenant governor on Wednesday to ask about his support for Governor Hochul's re-election bid. So, Jason, is it safe to assume you didn't go to the Rensselaer Park Elementary School in Troy for the sole purpose of hearing Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado participate in World Read Aloud Day? Did you have other motives?
I did have other motives.
And what was it that you were looking to ask the Lieutenant Governor about?
Well, obviously we know LG Delgado has really set a mark for himself in terms of defying the governor, and I wanted to ask him about his relationship with Hochul, since that's been a big question mark ever since he called on Biden to step out of the presidential race, and Hochul was out there as Biden's biggest fan and biggest supporter.
And how excited was he and his press team to see you in Troy on Wednesday?
So I actually did give them the courtesy, and I emailed them beforehand and made sure, I said, hey, is the lieutenant governor going to take any questions today? And I don't know if they were used to getting questions at events, but thankfully they said yes, and it was me and the reporter from the Troy Record, and we had very different questions. She was more interested about the book that he was reading to the children, but he wasn't too scared to see me, actually. He's a good sport.
Well, the answer he gave you when asked about whether he supported Governor Hochul and a re-election bid in 2026 is, my focus right now isn't on the election, my focus is on governing right now. That's the focus. That sounds like a poised, composed answer, but maybe it was different in the moment. Did he seem like this was a prepared, ready statement that he had ready for you?
I don't think the exact wording was prepared, but, his stance was definitely, he was definitely very comfortable saying, I'm not going to talk about the election. It seemed like he was prepared to give that line. I'm not going to answer this question.
And that's not too different from when I think you and I ran into him in the hallway about a month ago following the first day of session and some of the legislative breakfast receptions, and just tried to get an idea of what are you focusing on this year. And he basically said it was all a work in progress. So in the wake of an op-ed in the Times and some national interviews, have we gotten any more clarity about what he's going to be focusing on? Has he identified any issues or a role for himself in Albany other than head ribbon cutter and speaker at Read It Aloud World Day?
Well, as the lieutenant governor, his position is very much ceremonial. So that includes promoting various initiatives around the state, and often those initiatives are less sexy and less politically engaging. But I'm sure he would tell you, as he told the reporter from the Troy Record, that literacy is very important. And that's just part of his role. Maybe it's not the most interesting stuff. Even though I do cover the Capitol, I'd have to look into what exactly his star initiatives are as the LG. But I'm not going to knock him for doing his job as promoting literacy and other initiatives. I remember on Thanksgiving he was handing out turkeys just like Kathy Hochul in Manhattan. So, he's not necessarily there for the huge policy announcements, but every once in a while he shows his face, and reporters, if they wish, can show up, but it's definitely not as often as the governor.
Well, in addition to asking about his thoughts on the governor's bid, you also asked about their current working relationship, and how did he describe things? Has he been relegated to a broom closet and Kathy Hochul lost his number, or are they still partners in some sense?
It's funny because I asked him to characterize his relationship with the governor, and his response was just, we communicate a lot, and I'm comfortable communicating with her. And I said, well, that's not really a characterization of the governor. I just asked him the question again. I said, well, can you characterize the relationship? And his answer was, well, I just did. And I don't know if that's exactly how I would describe a relationship by just saying that I communicate with someone. I think that's just more describing what happens in the relationship. So I guess publicly, at least, he's not willing to neither side is really willing to describe the relationship. And I think that's probably smart than waging a public war. But
it's a cold war right now. It's not a hot war yet.
It's definitely a cold war. And we're not at the level where there's public statements criticizing or bashing each other.
Well, we know when those statements do come out that if listeners want to find them, they should keep an eye at the New York Playbook PM from Politico, where Jason is going to have all the scoops, and hopefully he'll be back again on Delgado Watch. Jason, thanks for being a good sport. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And now we're going to play our conversation with Bradley Honan, President and CEO of the Honan Strategy Group, which works on behalf of Democratic candidates and issues. You co-wrote an op-ed in the Times-Union that made the case that, quote, today it is less about 3 men in a room and increasingly about 36 voters attending a public hearing on Zoom, organized and activated constituents speaking up to their elected officials about proposed public policy. What is the argument you're trying to make about where power comes from in the Capitol right now and how decisions are being made?
We wrote the op-ed because I was very influenced by former State Senator Seymour Lockman's book from, I think, 2006, entitled 3 Men in a Room. Lockman passed away recently, and I thought that was an important opportunity for us to examine the power dynamic that he wrote about in his first book and then his subsequent book and other work that he was involved with. I'm a believer in political pendulums, and I think the political power spectrum is really what our hypothesis is here, Dave. Look, make no mistake about it. The governor's office is a powerful position. The assembly speaker is powerful. The state senate majority leader is powerful. But we're no longer in the era of Shelley Silver and Joe Bruno. Power has changed, and it has been democratized to a large degree. There's a big technology story that's a part of why and how it is much easier than ever before for voters to learn about the issues, speak out about the issues, and organize themselves. That is the democratization of information. You don't have to be in Albany to have a pretty clear idea about how some of these issues are playing out. I think there is also a critically important AOC rule or AOC lesson here, which is AOC, we'll come back and talk about the Trump surge that took place in 2008 that powered a lot of those candidates and their campaigns. She out-organized and she outworked Joe Crowley by a relatively small number of votes. What we detect from elected officials today is much more looking skeptically over your shoulders about whether there is a brewing grassroots movement that is arguing for and against a piece of public policy.
They're weather vanes, and the wind blows, they capture it.
They are very good at picking that up. Much harder to do that on a statewide level, much harder to do that in a congressional district. But if we're talking about a state senate, state assembly, they're able to do that, and that becomes effectively their full-time job, being the weather vane, to use your analogy. The 25 people that are speaking up about a particular issue could represent a larger pool of 200 people that got busy and didn't have a chance to come to the rally, didn't have a chance to send an email, didn't have a chance to send in a letter, call for a meeting, some other kind of political contact with their elected official. And so 25 or 35 people have convinced 2 or 3 elected officials that represent this area to speak out against it, to be against it, to lobby their colleagues against it. What they're looking over their shoulder, I believe, Dave, is for whether that's going to format into 250 people. That all of a sudden becomes 2,500 people or 3,500 people. One of those people gets pushed forward to be a candidate, to take this person on in a primary, and we start down a path where things start to get very, very dangerous. So what I'm suggesting is the democratization of political power, the democratization of technology, and frankly, the power of institutions. The New York Times is not doing local endorsements anymore. We saw very clearly in the exit polls in the presidential election, very, very strong, high number of unions that endorsed Kamala Harris. And yet, many of the members of these unions surged in their support of Donald Trump. So big institutional players have less power than ever before. I'm not suggesting people have all the power. Again, there's a very powerful dynamic going on in this building right now. But I sense a real change, an inflection point that we're in right now in people getting more active, more activated, more able to be vocal, more able to follow the issues, more able to mobilize. I'm talking about genuine political engagement and discourse,
more organic
from their
outreach.
Constituents. Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And we see when we reduce that friction and we communicate with people in legislative districts about what's going on and why they should speak out, and if we can facilitate a process by which they can figure out who their elected official is, because many of them don't know who it is, and how to contact them, and where in that legislative process their voice matters more, they're speaking out more frequently than we've seen before. And these elected officials, with their very, very sophisticated antenna and weather vanes, are picking up the type of political engagement that I don't think was possible back when Lockman wrote his book in 2006.
Okay, lot to unpack there. And luckily you put it all into bullets in the op-ed. So let's start with the 2018 Joe Crowley example, which you argue is reflective of the fact that politicians now are more focused on how issues are playing locally than ever before. I would argue that example is kind of an outlier because Joe Crowley didn't take this seriously at all and was kind of disengaged, maybe until the last second when it was too late. And we saw something similar with Sean Patrick Maloney in a general election. And then I think about someone like Kevin Cahill, an assembly member from the Hudson Valley, at least until he lost a primary. And that was something that was in large part because he was, one, not really well liked, and two, I think he was kind of resting on his laurels. And I think a lot of the races that we see where incumbents go down are because of those issues and not necessarily because they're on the wrong side of an issue. So are there specific incumbents, other than, say, Mike Gianaris, who you think have dramatically changed their political identity since 2018 in response to what's going on in their districts? Because I think of someone like Dee Dee Barrett, an assembly member from the Hudson Valley, who the left has tried to take out twice now over some energy issues, and she's withstood both challenges. Or someone like Kevin Parker, who's been primaried a couple times to his left, and he seems to be weathering things pretty well. So how do you think this is actually manifesting itself, this idea that they're more focused on issues playing locally? Because what's happening here in Albany hasn't changed too much since 2018, other than the fact that we now have a Democratic majority in the Senate and just have one-party control. Okay,
you threw out a lot of names, and yes, we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about that. I think you put your finger on it as it relates to Joe Crowley. Let's look at what Joe Crowley was trying to do back in 2018. He was running for House Speaker, and he was spending a disproportionate of time. I think he was promoting his book, if I recall correctly.
And probably some Bruce Springsteen stuff.
Maybe his guitar. He was traveling around the country. He was raising a lot of political donations for candidates that he hoped were going to ultimately vote for him in a speaker's race. And he took his eye off the prize. Look, we have done work, and I don't want to name any names. We have done work with longtime elected officials that lose their muscle memory because they don't get consistent primaries again and again. And so they get caught off guard by these challengers that, if they're well-financed and well-organized and can deliver a compelling message, have a chance of seating these candidates. I think the big story of the AOC race, to focus on that, was the number of people who turned out in that race who didn't have general election and certainly not primary voting history. What AOC did was she changed the face of the electorate. Right. I think the candidates that are able to figure out how to harness the power, and we're going to see this in June in New York City, and you're going to see it in 2026 in response to Donald Trump. The population who is going to cast a ballot is going to go up by 2 or 3 times, and the composition of who is going to vote is going to change. Only the most adept, sophisticated incumbents are able to respond to that, and challengers that are able to meet the moment and take advantage of that are going to oust people from office. But that's a calculus that's difficult to pull off in the best of circumstances.
Well, let's turn to another bullet point, which is this argument that legislative power has become decentralized. I would argue that is not the case, in large part because central staff, the behind-the-scenes staffers who actually make the trains run on time, seem to be as powerful as ever, given our conversations with lawmakers and the fact that there are so many newer members who can't necessarily throw their weight around the way as some of the more senior members. And then my understanding from conference, the meetings that the Democratic majorities have, is that while lawmakers get to voice their opinions and get to say what they want to prioritize on some issues, like when it comes time to close the budget, the leaders simply say, hey, this is the deal you've got, and we'll allow some crying and complaining, but it's April 14th, 15th, May 3rd, whatever. We need to have a deal. You cite, though, the number of bills being introduced as evidence of loosening of the leaders' grips in both houses. But again, I would argue that's because they don't care. Introduce your bills. Have fun. Push the Legislative Bill Drafting Commission to the extremes. So talk to me more about why you think there is a decentralized legislature.
Yeah, I think it starts with a governor who is weak, and that decentralizes powers to the 2 chambers in a way that we haven't seen before. We'll come back to...
She's still vetoing bills, and there's no veto overrides. I don't know when she seems weak. I mean, besides our perception of her.
I think politically she appears to a lot of elected officials as being wounded and perhaps mortally wounded politically in terms of her inability to communicate a message in a coherent way. That right there devolves power away from the chamber into the legislative bodies. The leadership, with all due respect, is a very different type of personality and structure than Lockman wrote about when he cited Joe Bruno and Shelley Silver. Just personality-wise, tenure, institutional knowledge, we can go deep into that, but there are very vivid differences in how these caucuses and chambers are run to how those folks operated in the past.
You don't think the changes are just around the margins or superficial? I mean, Andrea Stewart-Cousins is a much nicer person than Joe Bruno might have been to their members, but the way they actually...
She's a wonderful person, wonderful woman.
But does she wield power then in a demonstrably different way than Joe Bruno did? Because they both seem pretty effective at getting their agendas across the finish line.
We, I think, maybe spend a little bit too much time talking about personality and not about maybe some of the issue positions. Mm-hmm. There is a larger number of bills that get introduced. There are the kinds of stopgaps that Bruno or Shelley Silver would have never have seen the light of day.
Look, what do you mean?
I'm talking about elected officials holding press conferences, speaking out on social media about legislation.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
I was surprised. Maybe I should never be surprised. There were candidates that won their races for the first time in November who started publishing op-eds, who started putting out press releases about their legislative agenda before they're actually formally sworn into office. They then get into office, and I can tell you I probably had 6 or 8 conversations with elected officials who have been in office for 2.5 years or less who are already seeking promotion. In some cases from the state legislature looking at running for Congress, in the state Senate thinking about a statewide election. People are not spending a lot of time in these offices in the way they did. I worked for Elliot Engel on and off for 20 years, for Carolyn Maloney, both long-serving members of Congress. They got those positions. They worked very doggedly, and they continued to do that work. I don't know that we're invested today among elected officials in spending as much time and creating that kind of institutional knowledge. And I think the same thing has to do with the staff, which works very, very hard. I know there are a lot of open staff positions. I know that pay is an issue for legislative assistants, and it's very, very low relative to where they could be making it elsewhere. And so that creates a situation where there's not a lot of institutional knowledge, and they're more likely to lean on their constituents simply for the fact that they're auditioning for another job, and they want to be talking about how they served and how they solved real problems for people who could donate to their campaigns, who could organize themselves around their campaigns. They're much more responsive to that because they're going to need to tap into those people again and again and again in ways that I think are different before, because everybody is so ambitious. Everybody is not satisfied with where they are. And that proverbial greasy pole, there are so many claws on that every day. People are not content to sit where they are, Dave. That's my best analysis.
And now all I can think about is what Twitter would have been like if Shelley Silver was still ruling the chamber right now, and how members would likely be scared to send up some of the posts that they feel free to do now.
This is just an observation, but would we have been able to build the Brooklyn Bridge? Would we have been able to build the interstate highway system? Would we have been able to put a man or a woman on the moon if social media existed today?
Well, we still haven't gotten a woman onto the moon.
She's coming soon, as my understanding. But that, I think, is a fair point about whether the communications ecosystem has been sufficiently contaminated that prevents us from thinking big. And I frankly think we saw a lot of evidence of that in the State of the State address and the State of the City address. There were no moonshots coming from Mayor Adams. There's certainly no moonshots coming from Kathy Hochul. And I think that's a very, very disappointing place for a leadership state like New York State to be in today.
So I want to turn to another issue you brought up, which is this idea that, quote, institutional players have less impact. And you focus primarily on unions, and you make the case that they're not voting in lockstep, as you talked about earlier with the 2024 presidential election. And I have to imagine that's probably true when it comes to maybe more of the quote-unquote blue-collar unions. But when I think about the power that the teachers union or 1199 SEIU has in Albany, I would be hard-pressed to find an issue that the legislature, or even now the governor, in the wake of her failed efforts to change foundation aid last year, would be willing to tackle where they are on the opposite side of those unions. So other than the fact that they might not be voting as a bloc, what makes you feel like these institutional players, these unions, have less power in Albany?
let me just come back to the central thesis. Governor's office, still important. State Senate Majority Leader, important. Speaker, still important. Are a handful of major unions dominant and powerful in their ability to exercise power and to strike fear into elected officials? Absolutely. But that power has dissipated very, very considerably from where it was arguably 10 years ago. Not every union is like the UFT, which is largely, I guess, white-collar or pink-collar. There are a lot of blue-collar unions that have traditionally supported Democratic candidates, Democratic legislation that share with us their internal polls.
But Democrats and Republican lawmakers all rally behind the trade unions, so to speak. They all will support whatever they want in Albany. Their specific issues are still what dominates here, regardless of party. So how are you actually seeing that lessening of influence? You're saying it's different than it was in the past, but is there anything that stands out to you where the unions aren't getting what they want in Albany?
You should have some of them on your show, and the question you should ask them is, what is the gulf that they are seeing in their own data about what the sentiment of their own members are towards issues and politics? Mm-hmm. There is a growing gulf between the leadership and what the rank and file feel. I'm not suggesting that they're going to crash and burn and go out of existence. I don't want to have crazy talk here, Dave. But what I'm saying is there is a growing separation between powerful elite institutions and their constituencies. We can look at newspaper endorsements. We can look at candidate endorsements. We can look at fact sheets that different nonprofit groups put out. We can talk about some of the divides on some issues, not all of them, some issues between union leadership and their own members. Some of those are political in nature, and I think what we were talking before is the historic performance that Donald Trump had among union members. And so us perceiving these institutions, mega institutions, as monolithic, as getting all their members to march in lockstep, I think there is dissipating power there. It doesn't mean the groups you evidenced are not powerful, but the power is flowing away from them. And it may be more gradual for the couple of unions than you described than, for example, traditional media, which is in a very, very crisis period right now. But
we are not influential anymore.
And it's really amazing how much that has been democratized. So I'm looking at that category, Dave. Cut me some slack here. I'm looking at the whole category.
Slack cut,
check. Thank you very much. I owe you. I'm looking across the media. I'm looking at unions. In some cases, I'm looking at major employers as having less monolithic support, and therefore they are more reticent to exercise what they believe is their political will than they have been before.
Well, finally, you also talk about the impact of the changes to the state's public financing laws, essentially allowing legislative candidates, and now in 2026, statewide candidates to access matching funds for small dollar donations. We didn't necessarily see any dramatic changes to our election results in this first go-around, whether it was the primaries or the general elections. The makeup of both chambers are largely the same in terms of party enrollment, and there weren't any major incumbents getting taken down in the primaries. So how do you see this impacting the power in Albany? You talk about more money flowing from these lower dollar donors, but do you think it's actually impacting or will impact what lawmakers are prioritizing?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I appreciate you going through this in the bullet points, because the story here, I think, is there is no silver bullet. There is no single answer. It's a confluence of different factors that are coming together more or less at the same time, that are changing this power ecosystem that goes on here. We are in relatively early days of this new campaign finance system, as you alluded to. we have more experience in places like New York City for how this operates. My most recent conversation with an elected official I would characterize as not certain how, on a statewide basis, to really think about how to use the system. What typically was the case is if you could write a $1,000 check to a member of the state assembly, you were high on the totem pole in terms of having a voice with a candidate, a connection to the candidate, and your views on whatever issues you cared about would take on a whole lot more importance than the average person. What we've done with campaign finance reform is to democratize that power. And so your neighbor who can bring 20 people together because they serve on the PTA together, or their kids are all involved in the local Jewish day school, if you can bring those small micro-political constituencies together into your living room and host an event where everybody writes a check for $50 or $100.
Up to $250.
Up to $250, exactly right. You, Dave Lombardo, are arguably more powerful than your neighbor who is going to write a single $1,000 check. You are a micro-political influencer. So again, we're very early days in how the system is going to play out. It's just another reason on our mind why power is flowing back to the people, and it's going to be up to them about whether they can exercise it or not. As a Churchill, democracy is not a spectator sport. People have to be active in it. People have to be involved.
Well, you bring up this dynamic about the matching funds, and this was actually the focus of two songs in the LCA show last year. One, a parody of Macho Man, which was matching funds, and the idea that this is going to help all these candidates. Then we followed it up with a song parody of I'll Be Back, which came to be We've Got Dak, and this idea that that neighbor you mentioned who can give $1,000 to a candidate could also back up the dump truck to Dak or the equivalent for the Senate Democrats, and then they could come in and carpet bomb a district, or they could come on and put the finger on the scale, so to speak. So aren't there still levers that these large donors can pull to negate the impact of these small dollar donors at the end of the day?
Look, what I would say is I've worked for some of the biggest political spenders in the United States and around the world, people like Mike Bloomberg, Hillary Clinton ran for president, spent enormous sums of money. John Corzine running for the United States Senate and governor in New Jersey, enormous sums of money. But let's also look at how that money was spent. Kamala Harris did not turn out voters in urban Philadelphia. There's a great story, a horrifying story if you're a Democrat, where the Harris campaign in Philadelphia was not given resources to turn voters out. They picked up and they created a de facto campaign headquarters across the street, which is at a Dunkin' Donuts. And they managed to figure out how they could get resources to touch voters. They were identifying voters on Sunday before the Tuesday election, and Monday before the Tuesday election, they were greeting voters for the first time ever. And the voters said, I assume you've ignored me because
you don't need me.
You don't need me, and I'm not going to vote. And those people didn't turn out. Money is playing a much, much greater role in politics. There's no question about it. Citizens United has created an opportunity for people like Musk to go do this.
Or even the trial lawyers here in New York State with their ability to tap into pockets and donate to groups like DAC.
The dirty secret, I think, is much of the campaign dollars that are spent get frittered away, and Kamala Harris is probably the best case I can think of right now in terms of how she set money on fire. So having enormous resources, we wrote something, I think, for campaigns and elections about a congressional candidate in Westchester. I think that was the seat that Mondaire Jones won in a Democratic primary, maybe in 2018, if memory serves. It was a big field. 2020, thank you. It was a field of about 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 candidates.
A lot of former state legislators going down.
Absolutely. And there was one candidate who was a self-finance candidate, and we wrote an op-ed for Campaigns and Elections magazine about how self-funded candidates disproportionately set money on fire. They hide behind television ads. They don't go out and greet voters. The act, and this is, I think, actually one of the reasons why Mondami, coming back to the survey, is performing so well. He's going out to his donor base saying, free grocery stores, free buses, donate $5, $10, $25 to power this machine. So it's an ecosystem where he's not only raising money, but he's also communicating with people about what his vision and what his message is for office. And I think that's why he's got some real staying power. The act of donating to a candidate makes you invested in their success. And how do you help them be successful? You're going to try and raise more money. You're trying to get friends involved. You're going to knock on doors. And you're very, very highly correlated with turning out and casting a ballot. So the exercise of going through raising money is a very, very powerful way of creating grassroots political support.
Well, unfortunately, we've got to end the conversation there. We've been speaking with Bradley Honan. He's the CEO and president of the Honan Strategy Group, and we will link to his op-ed from the Times-Union on our website. Bradley, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
It's a great show. I'm so glad to be here today and look forward to your following shows because you ask good, penetrating questions.